Hello, movie lovers. Today I want to talk about another recent Criterion release a month or two ago, and this is Boat People. This is directed by Ann Hui, and I apologize for all the mispronunciations I might make in names, as I always do. And this was a movie from 1982, and for me it was a very surprising movie. My knowledge of Hong Kong cinema, from which this movie comes from, Ann Hui is one of the most honored Hong Kong directors, but my knowledge of it is kung fu, martial arts, sort of a fantasy world. Choi Huk, King Hu. I really like King Hu's films. And even Wong Kar-wai is sort of a fantasy kind of romantic fantasy kind of world that doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with reality. And John Woo's thrillers, which are also sort of fantasy movies, very violent. And I often wonder, what other kind of films do people in Hong Kong go to see? And they went to see Boat People. But judging from the cover, the kind of muted, kind of washed out look of the cover and the artwork in general, you might expect a kind of a neo-realism documentary kind of look. Reading about the director, she did make some documentaries for television. So it was very surprising, even though there are elements of neo-realism and documentary in the film, in Boat People. There's lots of melodrama and lots of misery within that melodrama. And from an aesthetic point of view, when I was watching the film, I thought, boy, this is an overload of misery and a very depressing movie. And so that was one surprise, all the melodrama. But I was also, again, judging by the kind of artwork that they used as the motif for this release. I was also surprised that it was a very colorful movie. There are scenes at night, but for the most part, the colors and the transfer looks very, very good. And of course, I don't have the context I was not familiar with Ann Hui, Hui, I think it is the proper pronunciation. I was unacquainted with her films. I knew her name because I read a book on Choi Huk, and I also saw her in the credits, I believe, and in fact she was a protege of King Hu on some of his early films, and she went out on her own pretty much when she was very young. She had attended film school in London for a couple of years before coming back to Hong Kong. And of course, the Boat People of the title of this film, this was the Boat People of Vietnam, leaving Vietnam on boats in perilous journeys to get many of them on their way to Hong Kong. The beginning passage of the movie is when the Americans, the U.S. troops have left, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese come into Saigon, and there's a Japanese photographer who takes all the pictures of this, and he is considered sympathetic to the regime, so he's invited back 3 years later. And most of the film takes place 3 years after the Americans have left. And the movie itself is only 7 years since that, 1982. So the Boat People were a big event in this era, in the late 70s into the 80s, because so many of Vietnamese people were leaving. They had trouble adjusting to the dictatorship. They were now living under a dictatorship when the individual is consumed by the alleged needs of the state world of lies and cover-up, so that when this Japanese photography returns to Vietnam, He has given a view of it that is all staged for his benefit. And he sort of figures that out. And he then befriends a destitute family, a mother and her 3 children, to document their lives, the actual lives of real people, rather than what the state wants him to document. But he is considered heroic, but they're keeping an eye on him. And he gets very much involved with this family. And so it is a very timely themes of displacement, that immigrants and living in a state of hopelessness, they want to go somewhere where there might be hope. And many of these people express, I want to get to the States. I want to open a bar in New Orleans. I have to get to the States. It's a long journey and a perilous one. And even though there's lots of misery in the film, it's well documented by the director herself, because she created an oral history of the events that impelled these Vietnamese people to flee their country. And she would go to where the boat people, they had camps, immigrant camps, and in the beginning, countries were very sympathetic to their plight, Hong Kong as well. And so with this kind of hopelessness, or this kind of hopelessness coming from a dictatorship now ruling South Vietnam, it struck a chord too with the people of Hong Kong, because they were maybe 25 years away, maybe less than that. I guess it was 1997, so about 15 years away from the mainland dictatorship coming to exert its influence and eventually its power over Hong Kong. So the kind of relative individual freedom that they had during the British rule would be gone, and what was it going to be like? So the movie was controversial. It got a lot of great reviews. It did good business. Then it started to get banned, and it was originally accepted for the competition at the Cannes Film Festival. But then the French socialist government, feeling that it was the movie was an insult to the government of Vietnam, they didn't want to offend them in any way. So it was quietly withdrawn. But then it got shown anyways. They sort of snuck it in through the back door, and it did get, the same kind of positive reaction from audiences that it had in Hong Kong. But the Chinese also banned it. Now this was an era where the Hong Kong filmmakers were filming in China, and with encouragement from the Chinese government. But boat people, ironically, you never know what dictators are going to feel about anything. They banned boat people to be shown in China because they felt that the director was too easy on the Vietnamese government, because they were at some sort of territorial war or impasse with Vietnam's northern borders. So again, it's all the context, and this is why Criterion and these kinds of boutique labels, why it's so important that they put so many supplements in their films, because you really need it to really understand the full scope of the movie, what it meant for this particular time when the world was horrified by pirates attacking these boats, the perilous seas. They wouldn't know. The Vietnamese were just rolling the dice. The immigrants were just rolling the dice as to what their fate may be. So in the supplements, we get about a 20-minute recording of Ann Hui as she's being interviewed at the Cannes Film Festival and being very critically questioned as to her, this was propaganda, which and that she was influenced by the Chinese. The Chinese had no influence. They provided a lot. They wanted films to be made in China. They provided all the facilities that they could possibly do, so it was a good place to film, but they had no influence whatsoever. The movie was based on her own interviews with boat people who were successful in making it to Hong Kong. And there's also two documentaries, and these are just superb documentaries. One's from 1997. This is the first when the handover from the British to Chinese mainland was taking place, and this is directed by Hui herself, and we see her with her friends and reminiscing about these are friends from her university days. When she was in university in 67, 68, there were huge riots in Hong Kong that heavily influenced her and her schoolmates, and then there's a documentary from 2020, and this is just absolutely superb. I think it was directed by one of her colleagues, I think her longtime art director, I believe it was. And it shows her life and her interests, and she lived a very solitary life. She never married. We see her living alone in her 70s, tending to her elderly mother, and looking back on her career, and reminiscing about the slumps, because she had big, even though she was very much rewarded with the local version of the Oscars in Hong Kong, she had big slumps, and she would be dismissed as a director, and they didn't do well at the box office, and then she would make a movie, and then she would recharge her optimism, and she lived for her work. It's a remarkable portrait, and also shows her childhood. She went to a Catholic school through 12th grade, and then to Hong Kong University. But she was Catholic, and you do see some Catholic themes looking back now at boat people with this kind of context, especially this sort of kind of humanism, the self-sacrifice. It's there, and many of her concerns of people not belonging where they are. They have to go someplace else. And when she was a child, she went back and forth to her grandparents, and her father was a scholar. Her mother, we get a really good portrait of her mother as seen by Ann Hui, and her two siblings, one of whom lives in the U.S., one lives in Canada. And then we see her in her old age, and she was a absolute beauty, the director's mother. So then we get a booklet as well, and it has two terrific essays in it, and I would be lax not to acknowledge George Lamb and Season Ma, and that's the photographer in the bottom. That's the 14-year-old girl of the family that he befriends and documents their life and gets very involved in their circumstances. And two terrific essays in this booklet. And I'm going to link to the trailer for Boat People. I'll also link to Daisuke Beppu's discussion of the film, and also James' 20th and 21st century movies. They're well worth checking out. So thanks everybody who managed to listen to me. I do appreciate it. Comments are welcome. Take care.